He had survived 2 world wars, multiple battlefronts, and even assassination threats. He was the man who crushed the Nazis' dreams with tanks, fury, and a mouth that could terrify both enemy and ally. But then, in the winter stillness of post-war Europe, General George S. Patton was silenced. Not on the battlefield, not by a bullet, but by a strange, almost mundane event, a car crash that seemed too convenient, too clean, too final. December 1945. The world was finally quiet. And yet, the most dangerous general in America, the one feared not by Germans, but by Washington and Moscow alike, was suddenly gone. No autopsy, no military inquiry, and a trail of contradictions that would fuel speculation for decades. Was it an accident? Was it an assassination? Or was it something far more subtle, the slow strangling of a man who had outlived his usefulness to the New World Order? This is not just the story of how General Patton died. It is a journey into how power disposes of its champions when they no longer fit the game. And a question that echoes today: was George Patton the first casualty of the Cold War? George Smith Patton Jr. was born in 1885, but in truth, he belonged to an earlier time. Raised in a household steeped in Confederate lore and military honor, he idolized warriors of ancient Rome and the Southern cavalrymen of the Civil War. He memorized battles as a child, rode horses like a knight, and spoke of destiny before he could spell it. By the time he graduated from West Point in 1909, he was already seen as something of a throwback, a man out of place in a mechanizing world. But in that paradox lay his strength. Patton believed in war not as policy, but as a proving ground of will. And so when the First World War erupted, he saw it not with horror, but with purpose. He joined General Pershing's expedition to chase Pancho Villa in Mexico. Then he landed in France with the American Expeditionary Force. There, Patton found his new steed, the tank. While other generals still dreamed in trenches, Patton strapped into an armored box and led from the front, blazing through barbed wire and machine gun fire. Wounded in battle, praised for bravery, he returned home a hero, but restless. Between the wars, Patton studied, wrote, and trained. He turned tank warfare into an art form long before blitzkrieg became a German word. He was waiting for history to give him another chance. It came in 1941. The bombing of Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into World War II. And Patton, by then a brash, foul-mouthed general known for slapping helmets and demanding speed, was unleashed upon the world once again. He stormed through North Africa. He tore through Sicily. And when his beloved Third Army was finally activated, he rampaged across France like a medieval warlord on wheels. To his troops, he was a legend. To his enemies, a ghost. To the high command, a liability. Because Patton did not play politics. He played to win. And when the war ended, he did not celebrate. He looked east, toward the Soviets, and what he saw disturbed him. By May 1945, Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and Nazi Germany had surrendered. But the victors were not united. The uneasy alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had only held long enough to crush a common enemy. Now, with Europe in ruins, each began to draw their own maps and their own red lines. In the chaos of post-war Germany, Patton saw what others would not admit. The Soviets were not liberators. They were conquerors. Patton's Third Army occupied Bavaria, but his eyes were on Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the East. He saw Soviet troops looting, raping, arresting anti-communist leaders, and establishing shadow governments. Worse, he saw American and British leaders turning a blind eye. To Patton, this was betrayal, not just of the war's ideals, but of the millions who had died to defeat tyranny. He wrote in private letters, "The Russians are not our friends. They never have been. My God, how I hate those bastards." And in public, he grew louder. He demanded the United States stand up to Stalin. He urged a push eastward to finish the war that had only paused. But in 1945, war-weary America wanted peace. And its new enemy was no longer on the battlefield, but in its own ranks. A dangerous man in peacetime. The moment the guns fell silent, George Patton became dangerous. Not because he had lost his edge, but because he had not. Where other generals retired gracefully, Patton criticized the denazification policy, the treatment of German prisoners, and even the Allied plan to divide and reconstruct Europe. To him, it all smelled of moral hypocrisy. He did not defend Nazism, he despised it. But he also believed that punishing a defeated people only sowed the seeds for the next war. In an interview, he quipped, "The Nazi thing is just like a Democrat-Republican fight back home." It was the final straw. The press exploded. Congress turned its back. Eisenhower, who had once called Patton his finest field commander, stripped him of command of the Third Army and reassigned him to a desk job overseeing historical documentation in Bavaria. It was a humiliation wrapped in ceremony. And to Patton, it was treason. He wrote in his diary, "I am being put out to pasture, like a horse no longer fit to race." But he wasn't done yet. He planned to return to America, to resign his commission, and to speak freely, to expose what he saw as the surrender of the West to Soviet aggression, to warn the American people. He never got the chance. December 16th, 1945. General Patton was just days away from returning home. On that cold morning, he decided almost on a whim to go on a hunting trip outside of Mannheim, Germany. He was accompanied by his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, and driven in a 1,938 Cadillac staff car by his orderly, Private Horace Woodring. The route was routine. The mood was relaxed. There were no guards, no escort, no armored convoy. Strange, considering this was one of the most high-profile Americans in post-war Europe, a man who had survived assassination threats and still made enemies with his mouth. Just outside the city, near a rail yard, a U.S. Army 2.5-ton truck suddenly turned across their path. The Cadillac braked, but too late. The impact was minor, barely enough to dent the bumper. The others in the car were unharmed, but General Patton, he was slumped in the back seat, paralyzed from the neck down. A broken vertebrae, severed spinal cord, massive internal bleeding. He would never walk again. He was rushed to the military hospital in Heidelberg, where he lingered for 12 days. On December 21st, 1945, the first day of winter, George S. Patton died. Official cause of death, pulmonary embolism. But almost immediately, questions began to swirl. How could such a trivial accident kill a man like Patton? Why was the truck driver, a soldier named Robert Thompson, never court-martialed or even charged? Why were photographs of the wreck kept classified for years? Why was no autopsy performed? And why did the U.S. Army, so meticulous in every other wartime protocol, show such casual indifference to the death of one of its most iconic generals? Conspiracies in the fog? In the vacuum left by official silence, theories rushed in like winter wind. Over the decades, former intelligence officers, military insiders, and even journalists began to piece together a darker version of events. One of the most compelling accounts came from Douglas Bezada, a former OSS operative who claimed in a 1979 interview that he had been ordered to neutralize Patton. Not kill him, but ensure he was silenced. According to Bezada, the crash was staged. The truck driver was planted, and when the injury failed to kill Patton immediately, someone finished the job in the hospital. Then there is the testimony of Steven Skubik, a counterintelligence agent who claimed that Soviet operatives had put Patton on an assassination list. Skubik allegedly warned his superiors multiple times, but was ignored and later silenced. Of course, official historians dismiss these claims as fiction, the ramblings of bitter or opportunistic men. But they never fully explained the inconsistencies. The lack of an investigation, the sudden disappearance of key witnesses, the absence of Patton's personal effects, including his diary, which vanished for decades, and the disturbing fact that, for a man of such historical importance, his funeral was quiet, almost muted. Even Patton's wife, Beatrice, questioned the narrative. She was not allowed to see his body unescorted before burial. She believed something had gone terribly wrong, or terribly right, depending on one's point of view. Why would they want him gone? To understand why Patton may have been silenced, we must return to what he represented and what he threatened. In 1945, the world stood on the threshold of a new order. The Allies had won, but the peace was fragile. The Soviet Union occupied half of Europe. The United States and Britain were shifting toward a policy of containment, diplomacy, and cautious rebuilding. What they did not need, could not afford, was a rogue general calling for total war with Stalin. But that's exactly what Patton wanted. He believed the US should rearm and strike the Soviet Union while it still had the chance before the Red Army fully consolidated its hold on Eastern Europe. In a letter never published during his lifetime, Patton wrote, "We defeated the wrong enemy. The German army was a bulwark against Bolshevism. Now we have turned Europe over to the Red Plague." He wanted German officers reinstated to help fight the Soviets. He wanted Allied forces to continue eastward. He wanted and was dangerously close to achieving a national platform from which to challenge the entire strategy of the Truman administration. That could not be allowed. To Washington, and perhaps to Moscow, Patton had become an unacceptable risk. A wild card, a hero who no longer followed orders. And history has shown, time and again, what happens to men like that. The cold silence of the new war. After Patton's death, the world moved on. Germany was divided. The Iron Curtain fell. The Cold War began not with a shot, but with silence. And the memory of George Patton was sanitized. The brash, defiant, insubordinate general was repackaged as a war hero, a relic of World War II, not a prophet of what came next. His warnings about Soviet expansion, buried. His critiques of Allied policy, erased. His name would be remembered in film, in parades, in stone but not in strategy. And yet, those who study the early Cold War often return to one question. What if Patton had lived? Would he have reshaped America's stance toward the Soviet Union? Would he have prevented the division of Europe? Would Korea, Vietnam, even the Berlin Wall have unfolded the same way? Or would his hawkishness have triggered a third world war before the second one was even cold? There are no answers, only shadows. And in those shadows, Patton remains, unquiet, unforgotten, and perhaps not entirely at rest. In the decades since Patton's death, his image has become immortal. Bronze statues stand tall in Europe and America. His battlefield commands are studied at West Point and Sandhurst. His speeches fire-forged and unfiltered echo across military academies. And yet, the deeper truths of his final days remain shrouded. There is no monument for the silence that followed his death. No ceremony for the truth he tried to speak. For while the world honors General Patton the warrior, it quietly buries General Patton the dissident. He was, in many ways, too dangerous to remember and too powerful to forget. To the American public, he was the face of victory. To politicians, he was a storm they had barely survived. And to historians, he is a question. A man who spoke too clearly in a world that preferred ambiguity. A man who would not yield. Even in his most controversial moments, Patton's resolve never cracked. After being forced to apologize for slapping a shell-shocked soldier in Sicily, an act that nearly destroyed his career, he accepted the punishment, but never changed his convictions. He believed in courage. He believed in discipline. He believed that war should be fought with full commitment or not at all. And above all, he believed in destiny. He once wrote, "All men are afraid in battle. The coward is the one who lets his fear overcome his sense of duty. Duty is the essence of manhood." In the modern era of sanitized warfare and risk-averse generals, such language may sound archaic, even dangerous. But to those who stood under his command, Patton was not just a general. He was a force of nature, an embodiment of ancient wrath in a modern world. A Caesar with a revolver. Enemies on all fronts. In the weeks before his death, Patton made a series of moves that in hindsight read like the acts of a man who knew time was running out. He wrote to journalists. He drafted speeches. He met secretly with politicians sympathetic to his views. He expressed open contempt for denazification policies, calling them a political witch hunt that will destroy more than it reforms. He ordered classified photographs and records of Soviet atrocities in Eastern Europe to be preserved and sent to Washington. He spoke of resigning his commission and running for public office. And perhaps most damning, he re-established contact with senior Wehrmacht officers, hoping to document their accounts of Soviet brutality and American mismanagement. To some, these were the acts of a paranoid man unwilling to adapt. To others, they were the final chess moves of a soldier who saw the next war before anyone else dared to admit it. The quiet censoring of a giant? After Patton's funeral, no major investigation was ever held. No congressional hearing summoned witnesses. No military tribunal examined the crash. The truck driver, Robert Thompson, vanished from public records for decades. His statements were never released to the press. The Cadillac in which Patton was injured was quickly repaired, then destroyed. And Patton's personal letters and diary, last seen in Heidelberg, went missing for more than 30 years before fragments reappeared, heavily edited. The message was clear. Let the legend live, but bury the man. And so they did. Hollywood made him into a war god. The Pentagon used his image as a recruiting tool. The public remembered the scowl, the swagger, the shouting, but not the warnings, not the disobedience, not the isolation, not the slow silencing of a man who saw too far, a memory that refuses to die. Over time, the Cold War would vindicate many of Patton's fears. Eastern Europe fell behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets staged coups in Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Berlin was walled off. Wars raged in Korea and Vietnam. American intelligence confirmed Soviet infiltration of Allied zones as early as 1945, just as Patton had claimed. And yet, by then, he was long gone. Erased, not by history, but by history's caretakers. And so we are left with a paradox. Patton died a hero, but not on his terms. He won the war, but lost the peace. He defeated the Axis, only to be outmaneuvered by allies. And perhaps that is the most painful truth. For men like Patton, victory was never enough. They needed honor. They needed clarity. And in the fog of politics, they suffocate. There is a story, told quietly by one of the nurses at the U.S. Army Hospital in Heidelberg, where Patton spent his final days. According to her recollection, on the evening before his death, Patton, barely able to move, breathing through pain, whispered something to his aide. No one remembers the exact words. But the aide later said, "He didn't sound like a man afraid of death. He sounded like a man frustrated that history would move on without him. For a man who had lived on the front lines of every war of his lifetime, to die in silence, in a bed, while his enemies and allies alike repositioned themselves, it must have felt like betrayal by the very world he helped save." George Patton was not made for peace. Peace required compromise. He only knew victory or defeat. And now, with neither on offer, he faded away like a sword without a wielder. What the generals wouldn't say. In private, many of Patton's fellow generals expressed admiration and fear. Eisenhower, for all his public rebuke, once said, "Patton's instincts on Soviet intentions may have been more accurate than ours." Omar Bradley, the soldier's general, called Patton the most brilliant combat commander the United States ever produced. But brilliance alone is dangerous. It exposes lies. It makes others uncomfortable. And so, when the Cold War began in earnest, with its backroom diplomacy, covert operations, and nuclear standoffs, Patton's doctrine of total war became obsolete. He had no place in a world built on delay, denial, and détente. He was not a diplomat. He was not a politician. He was, in the end, a man of war who died in a time that no longer wanted warriors. Truth in the rearview mirror. It's been nearly 80 years since Patton's Cadillac struck that army truck near Mannheim. But the questions remain. Why did one of America's greatest generals die in such obscurity? Why were the circumstances so poorly investigated or not investigated at all? And what would the world look like today if he had lived just a few more years? Would the United States have confronted the Soviets earlier? Would Europe look different? Would the Cold War have turned hot? Or would Patton, discredited and cast aside, have become a fringe voice shouting into the wind? History is not a courtroom. It rarely gives us verdicts, only patterns. And in the pattern of silenced men, erased truths, and buried warnings, Patton's story feels hauntingly familiar. An unfinished march. Patton once said, "It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God that such men lived." But perhaps, in his case, we are allowed both to mourn the silence and to thank the noise. He was a storm no one could fully control, a warrior who defied politics, bureaucracy, and even victory. And in the end, that may have been his greatest threat. Because systems do not fear guns. They fear those who refuse to aim them the right way. And Patton? He aimed only one way forward. Always forward. Open ending. I'm on still riding. There are those who say that Patton's ghost still rides the fields of Europe, not in superstition, but in consequence, in every decision made by a military afraid of ambition, in every hesitation of a leader who wonders what might have been, in every corner of the Cold War that still lives on, beneath the surface of modern politics. Was it an accident? A conspiracy? A necessary sacrifice? Or simply the end of a man whose time had passed? We may never know, but history does not forget those who tried to change its course, even when it buries them. If you found this journey thought-provoking, consider supporting Legacy Files by subscribing, because history does not end. It only waits for someone to tell it right.